In Kaelen's studio, it was always raining. Outside, whether the sky stained by the neon lights of Ethelberg was bright blue or leaden gray, the drops that trickled down the glass walls inside this room never stopped. This was an illusion of course. Just like Kaelen's work itself, it was a carefully controlled deception, designed to create a melancholic atmosphere. Because people didn't come to Kaelen to bring him their happiness, but their most precious sorrows. And sorrow brewed. Best in the rain. He was a memory artist, one of the best in his profession. He would pull the delicate, unreliable threads of memory from people's minds, clean them, repair them, and then reweave them as three-dimensional, living ghosts inside the massive milky glass sphere that stood in the center of his studio. The memo sphere. His client today, Mrs. Vesper, sat silently in the leather armchair in front of the sphere. Her eyes were locked on the scene coming to life inside. It was her last goodbye. The memory of that final ordinary Sunday morning with her husband Elias, who had passed away a year ago. Kaelen worked at the control panel with the precision of an orchestra conductor. His fingers danced over the illuminated buttons and touchscreens, adjusting every sensory detail of the memory. Inside the sphere, Vesper and Elias's kitchen was recreated down to the smallest detail. Kaelen had enriched the raw data pulled from Vesper's mind with his own artistic touch. He had slightly increased the angle of the morning sun seeping through the window, and made the scent of freshly brewed coffee in the air more pronounced. He had added a crackling jazz melody from Elias's favorite radio station to the background. These were small tricks, yes. But what made memories real were not the grand events, but these small imperfect details. The ghost of Elias inside the sphere smiled at his wife. This was the part Kaelen struggled with the most, but was also most proud of. To recreate the micro-expressions on a person's face, that momentary glint in their eyes, the silent language of love, required not just technical skill, but an artist's intuition. Elias placed his cup on the table and took a step toward his wife. Mrs. Vesper leaned forward in her chair. Tears were streaming from her eyes. She raised her hand toward the sphere, as if she could touch the glass wall between them. It was the heartbreaking, hopeless reflex Kaelen saw in every session. "I love you, Elara," said the Elias inside the sphere. His voice was a warm, clear copy of the raw sound waves taken from Vesper's memory, cleaned by Kaelen's software. "I love you too," Mrs. Vesper whispered into the silence of the room. Kaelen knew they were approaching the end of the memory. Elias had opened his arms to embrace his wife. This was the most intense, most painful moment of the memory. Most of his clients asked him to stop the memory at this exact point. They couldn't bear the pain of reliving that last touch, that final warmth. Kaelen held his finger over the stop button, but Mrs. Vesper whispered, "Continue." Kaelen obeyed the command. The ghost of Elias embraced his wife. In that moment, Kaelen activated one of the system's most advanced features. The sensors in the armrests of the chair applied a gentle warmth and a soft pressure to Vesper's body, creating a pale imitation of that lost embrace. It was his most expensive and controversial service. Whether it was a comfort or a form of torture depended on the person. The memory ended with the ghost of Elias slowly turning transparent and fading away along with the smell of coffee and the jazz melody. The sphere returned to its milky, empty state. Mrs. Vesper sat for a while longer, staring into that emptiness, her body shaken by sobs. Kaelen gave her time. He was not a therapist. He was just a technician, an artisan. He didn't fix people's sorrows. He only offered them the chance to face that sorrow one last time, in its most beautiful form. When Mrs. Vesper finally composed herself and left, Kaelen dimmed the lights of the studio. He turned off the rain illusion. The room returned to silence and ordinariness. Kaelen sank wearily into his chair. Reliving someone else's deepest memory would leave a void in his own soul. The tablet on his desk lit up. a new appointment confirmation. Tomorrow morning, at first light. The client's name was one of the most powerful and mysterious in the city, Mr. Caspian Silus. The request was not a standard grief session. It was specified as a memory retrieval for business purposes. Such jobs were more complex, more dangerous, and much more lucrative. Kaelen turned off the tablet. Tomorrow would not be an ordinary day. He could feel it. And what he didn't know was that what he would find in Mr. Silas's mind was not just a lost business deal, but a secret that would shake the very foundation of his own life and memories. The next morning, as a pale dawn was just breaking over Ethelberg, the studio door chimed. The visitor was Caspian Silus, the city's ruler who lived in the shadows. Silus had not come with an assistant or an army of bodyguards. He was alone. The dark, impeccably tailored coat he wore seemed to absorb the light around it. His face, with its sharp features, resembled a marble mask devoid of emotion. His eyes were as cold and piercing as a surgeon's scalpel. He was not a grieving client. He had come to solve a problem. "Mr. Kaelen," he said, his voice neither warm nor cold, simply a statement of fact. "My time is limited. Let us begin." Kaelen gestured for him to take the seat in front of the memisphere. But this time, he brought an additional device next to the chair. This was the deep dive interface. Grief sessions were based on gently collecting the emotional memories on the surface of the mind. A retrieval for business purposes, however, was like brain surgery. It required descending into the depths of the mind, forcing the structure of memories, and sometimes bypassing the subconscious's defense mechanisms. It was dangerous. There was always a risk of a memory artist's mind getting lost in the client's. "You are aware of the process, are you not?" Kaelen asked as he placed the interface's sensors on Silas's temples. "This is a more intrusive method than a standard session. Your mind may resist." "My mind obeys my commands," Silus said without even blinking. "What I am looking for is simple. A merger negotiation with our rival company, Cygnus Corp, a year ago. The deal was called off at the last minute for an unexplained reason. There is a gap in my memory regarding the last 10 minutes of that meeting. A word, a number, a facial expression. I want you to fill that gap." Kaelen nodded and went to the control panel. When he activated the interface, what he felt was completely different from the warm, melancholic ocean of Mrs. Vesper's mind. Entering Silas's mind was like infiltrating a fortress made of ice with smooth walls. Everything was orderly, categorized, and cold. There was no emotional noise. Memories were arranged in chronological order, like files. This was the most disciplined, most controlled mind Kaelen had ever encountered. He quickly found the memory he was looking for. Cygnus Corp meeting. He began to project the memory into the memisphere. Inside the sphere, a sterile, windowless meeting room appeared. In the middle was a glossy black table, and around it sat men in expensive suits with expressionless faces. The ghost of Silus sat at the head of the table like a king. Kaelen fast-forwarded the memory to the last 10 minutes. Everything was as Silus had described. Numbers, offers, legal jargon. But then, Kaelen noticed something strange. The memory was too clean, too sharp. Real memories always had blurry edges, unexpected emotional leaks. But this memory seemed like a movie scene, rehearsed and edited over and over. Kaelen trusted his intuition. This was not the real memory. This was a screen placed over the real memory. He pressed a button on the control panel. It was a risky technique called harmonic resonance. It analyzed the emotional frequency of the memory and tried to detect the presence of another memory hidden behind it, one that was dissonant with it. On his screen, behind the meeting memory, a much more chaotic, much more powerful signal appeared. It was like a locked door. Kaelen hesitated. Entering a locked memory without the client's permission was professional suicide. but his curiosity overpowered his professionalism. He decided to just crack the door open for a moment, just for a second. He focused all his power on that signal. For an instant, the sterile image of the meeting room shattered, and Kaelen fell through the void behind that fragmentation into another world. What he saw was not a meeting room. It was a dim, damp room. On the floor was an old bed, and sitting on the bed was a little girl, about 7 or 8 years old, looking directly at him with frightened eyes. The child's face was seared into Kaelen's mind like a brand. But the truly shocking thing was not the image he saw, but the emotion he felt. This was not an emotion that belonged to Silas's cold, controlled mind. This was a pure, unadulterated grief, a loss, and a fatherly love. And that emotion was painfully familiar to Kaelen. It was his own emotion. Just then, the defense mechanisms in Silas's mind kicked in like an alarm. Kaelen was violently ejected from the mental connection, as if he had been grabbed by the throat by an invisible hand and thrown out. He was left breathless at the control panel. His head was spinning, his heart was pounding. Silas was sitting calmly in the chair. He opened his eyes. "Did you find anything, Mr. Kaelen?" he asked, his voice as expressionless as ever. Kaelen looked at him, but he no longer saw just a client. He saw a man who harbored a piece of his own mind, a memory that should never have been there. "No," he lied. "Nothing. The gap is still there." "Caspian." Silas rose from the chair with a calm grace, as if nothing had happened. He adjusted his coat and, without looking Kaelen in the eye for even a moment, placed a credit chip on the table containing twice the agreed-upon fee. It was not a payment, but a hush money, a warning. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Kaelen," Silas said as he walked to the door. Sometimes there's a reason why some doors remain locked. One should not force them. Then he paused, his hand on the doorknob, but did not turn. "Especially if that door does not belong to you." And then he was gone. He left behind a chilling threat that mingled with the silence of the studio, and that impossible image that kept replaying in Kaelen's mind. Kaelen sat motionless at the control panel for hours. His body was ice cold. His mind was trying to rationalize what he had seen. "Emotional bleed," he murmured to himself. It was one of the most well-known dangers of the profession. During a deep dive, the artist's own subconscious could latch onto a strong emotion in the client's mind and project a piece of their own memories. It was rare, but not impossible. The girl he had seen, the grief, it must have all been a trick of his own mind. The locked door in Silas's mind had simply triggered his own trauma. That was the logical explanation. That was the safe one, but this explanation was not enough to silence the gnawing doubt in the depths of his soul. The texture of that memory was so real, so alien. And most importantly, that emotion, that fatherly love and grief, yes, it belonged to Kaelen. But in that memory, it was felt from a different perspective, as if he were inside another body. As evening fell, he restarted the artificial rain in his studio. He hoped the rhythmic flow of the drops on the glass would clear his thoughts. But every drop seemed to reflect the face of that little girl, those frightened eyes. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't live with this doubt. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He opened a hidden compartment in the control panel. Inside was an encrypted drive that could only be opened with his own fingerprint. This was his anchor. Every memory artist had a personal archive of their most fundamental, most unchangeable memories to maintain their mental integrity. These memories served as lighthouses they could return to if they got lost in the minds of others. Kaelen hadn't touched his own anchor in years, especially not one particular memory, the most painful one. He connected the drive to the system. A list of his own memories appeared on the screen. With a trembling finger, he selected the file labeled Elara. The last day, the memory of the brightest light of his life, which had ended in a hospital room 7 years ago. He took a deep breath and projected the memory into the memosphere. The inside of the sphere instantly transformed into that sterile, antiseptic-smelling hospital room. The rhythmic, heart-piercing beeps of the machines on the walls filled the studio. On the bed lay his little daughter, Elara, with her pale face and thin body. Kaelen's own ghost sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter's tiny hand. Kaelen, in his chair, felt a lump in his throat as he watched this scene. The pain, even after 7 years, was as sharp as the first day. He focused his eyes on his daughter's face inside the sphere. That familiar, much-missed face. And then, the blood in his veins froze. His heart stopped. His breath caught. Because the little girl lying in the bed in his own memory, that pale, innocent face, was identical to the face of the girl he had seen that morning in the darkest corner of Caspian Silus's mind. There was no room for doubt. The same hazel eyes, the same faint freckle on her nose, the same curve of her lips. This was impossible. This was beyond science, beyond logic, beyond everything he knew. An emotional bleed could project a memory, but it couldn't copy it and place it in someone else's mind, in their most protected vault. Kaelen stood up in horror. He staggered backward. His eyes darted between the sphere where his own memory was playing and the empty chair where Silus had sat. He hadn't opened the wrong door. Someone had stolen his most precious, most painful memory, created a copy, and locked it away like a secret in another man's mind. And Kaelen understood then that this was about much more than finding a lost business deal. This was a battle to reclaim a stolen piece of his own soul. And his enemy was none other than the most powerful man in the city. After the initial wave of horror passed, it was replaced by a cold, sharp anger. Kaelen's studio was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. The ghost of his daughter Elara, still hanging in the memosphere, was now not just a memory, but the echo of a stolen soul, a piece of evidence. Someone had entered his most sacred, most private sorrow, copied it, and placed it in another's mind like a commodity. This was not just a technological violation. It was a spiritual assault. Kaelen's first instinct was to storm Caspian Silus's gates, but that would be like an ant challenging a giant. Silus was the invisible king of Ethelberg. With a snap of his fingers, he could make evidence disappear, silence witnesses, and erase Kaelen from the city's memory. He could not win this war with brute force. This would have to be a war of intellect and technology. He returned to the control panel. A corner of his mind was still whispering, "This could be a trap. Silus knows that you know his secret. Perhaps this is a game set up to lure you into a mistake." But the face of his daughter, that stolen memory, suppressed all logical warnings. This was no longer a professional curiosity. It was a personal vendetta. The first thing he had to do was gather proof. As he exited Silus's mind, the system had automatically saved the raw data of the session to an encrypted file. It was a standard security procedure. Kaelen opened the file. On the screen, a river of meaningless codes and data streams appeared. But Kaelen could read this language. He could see the architecture of Silus's mind, the digital fingerprints of his memories. For hours, he examined the digital remnants of that locked memory. He compared it, side by side, with his own memory. And what he found confirmed his fears. The memory in Silus's mind was not a copy. It was more complex. It was a graft. The emotional core of Kaelen's original memory had been taken and re-encoded to fit the logical structure of Silus's mind. The emotional data, that fatherly love and grief, belonged to Kaelen. But the rest of the memory, that dim room, that old bed, had been patched together with fragments of other, older memories from the depths of Silus's mind. This was not the work of a thief. This was the work of a master, a memory artist. An artist even more skilled, more daring than Kaelen himself. This discovery made everything even more dangerous. This was not just Silus's personal obsession. This was part of a larger operation where memories were being illegally transferred and manipulated. Kaelen knew what he had to do. He had to go to the regulators, the unit that oversaw technological crimes in the city. But what would he tell them? I found a memory of my dead daughter in the mind of the most powerful man in the city. They would see him as either a madman or a conspirator trying to frame Silus. He needed concrete, undeniable proof. The memory itself was not enough. He had to prove how and by whom the memory was placed there. In that moment, a name appeared in his mind. A name from the early years of his profession. A name now almost forgotten, Silus Marner. Marner had once been a brilliant memory artist like Kaelen. But then, he had begun to push the ethical boundaries of the profession, getting involved in illegal memory erasure and alteration. His license had been revoked and he had gone underground. According to rumors, he now lived as a whisper in the city's dark technology market, in the dangerous world where memories were bought and sold like drugs. If anyone knew who could perform such a complex memory graft, it was Marner. But finding Marner was like hunting a ghost. And even if he found him, getting him to talk would be even harder. This meant Kaelen had to step out of his clean, sterile studio and into the dangerous and unpredictable world of Ethelberg's cyberpunk streets. Kaelen looked at the ghost of his daughter in the memosphere one last time. Then, with a decisive move, he shut down the memory. The time for grieving was over. The time for war had begun. As he locked the door of his studio behind him, Silas's icy warning echoed in his mind. Especially if that door does not belong to you. Kaelen whispered to himself, "It's mine now." The upper levels of Ethelberg were a symphony of order and aesthetics. Mag trains glided silently between glass towers, and holographic trees in the parks changed color with the seasons. Kaelen's studio belonged to this world. But that night, Kaelen crossed the boundaries of that world and descended into the city's veins. Into the chaotic, neon-washed labyrinth known as the Veins. This place was the complete opposite of the upper world. The air was filled with the smell of fried noodles, wet concrete, and the ozone of cybergenetic modifications. In the narrow streets, holographic ads, reflected on the rain-slicked asphalt, danced like dragons and geishas, creating fleeting, colorful tattoos on the faces of the crowd. This was a place where the law was flexible, and morality was a currency. And to find a ghost like Silus Marner, Kaelen had to walk in this darkness as his destination was a notorious information exchange called the Synapse. From the outside, it was an unmarked door with only a flashing neon brain symbol. When he entered, a wall of smoke and synthetic alcohol hit him. The place was dim and crowded. Data smugglers, memory addicts, and cybersurgeons were doing business. At tables with whispers and encrypted handheld terminals. Kaelen's high-quality, clean coat instantly marked him as a stranger. As prey, he was looking for the man sitting at a table in the darkest corner of the bar, surrounded by a data shield. His name was Rune. Rune was an information broker, but information was not the only thing he sold. He also sold silence. When Kaelen approached, Rune didn't even look up. His eyes were locked on the constantly changing data streams projected onto the surface of the table. "The Synapse doesn't accept tourists, artist," Rune said, his voice having the mechanical timbre of a synthetic larynx. "You've lost your way." "Not my way," Kaelen said calmly. "I'm looking for a ghost. His name is Silus Marner." This name seemed to have caught Rune's attention. The data stream stopped. The man slowly lifted his head. One half of his face was a complex network of cybergenetic implants. One of his eyes was a bright, red lens. "That's a dangerous name," he said, "a forgotten name. Why don't you remain one of the forgetful?" "It's a personal matter," Rune laughed. It was a mechanical sound. "Everything is personal here. And everything personal has a price. What's your price?" Kaelen had come prepared. He took a small crystal data stick from his pocket. This is a memory. Raw, unprocessed, first class. The smell of the moment the first lightning after a summer rain hits the earth in Tuscany. No synthetic can replicate it. This was the currency of the veins, real, pure, organic memories. Memory addicts would kill for a dose of this kind. Rune's red lens focused on the stick for a moment. It scanned the data. Then he nodded. Good stuff, he said. But the ghost of Marner is more expensive than a smell. Then what do you want? Why you're looking for him, Rune said. Silus, Caspian Silus. He was at your studio this morning. Half the city listens to the other half, artist. Where there is Silus, there is danger, and danger increases my rates. Kaelen froze for a moment. He hadn't expected Silas's shadow to be so long and so fast. There was no point in lying. In Silas's mind, I found a job that bears Marner's signature. A memory graft, very complex, very artistic. Rune was silent for a while. His red lens was scanning Kaelen's face, analyzing every micro-expression like a lie detector. Finally, he seemed convinced. He took the crystal stick. Marner lives like a ghost. Never sleeps in the same place twice, he said. But he has a weakness, his obsession with his own art. He loves the purest, most unfiltered form of memories, especially fear. Rune projected an address onto the surface of the table. This is the Raw Feed, an illegal memory parlor. People go there to experience the most terrifying memories of others, their deaths, their traumas. Marner is said to sometimes go there to watch his own works, like a painter watching a stranger look at his own painting in a gallery. Kaelen memorized the address. Thank you. Just as he was about to turn and leave, Rune's voice stopped him. Artist, he said. A piece of advice. If you find Marner, don't mention Silus. He's more afraid of the hunter who hunts the ghost than the ghost itself. The address Rune gave led Kaelen even deeper into the veins, into a labyrinth of rusty metal stairs and leaking steam pipes. This was the heart of a forgotten, abandoned industrial district of the city. The Raw Feed was hidden behind a heavy, steel door, covered in graffiti, with no sign or marking. When Kaelen pushed the door open, it was not light that entered, but silence. Unlike the chaotic noise of the synapse, this place was as quiet as a morgue. It was a large, hangar-like space, dominated by a dim, red lighting. The air was cold and metallic. It smelled like an unsettling mixture of a sterile laboratory and a slaughterhouse. Around the space were about 20 memory stations, resembling dentist chairs with complex cables and sensors dangling above them. At each station lay a client in a trance, with interfaces attached to their temples and necks. Their eyes were closed, but their faces were twitching with the borrowed nightmares they were experiencing. This was the final stop for memory addiction. They came here not for the smell of a rain in Tuscany, but to experience the pure, unfiltered terror a serial killer felt as he hunted his last victim. It was the ultimate escape. To take refuge from their own boring lives in someone else's most horrific moment. Kaelen scanned the space, taking refuge in the shadows by the wall. Most of the clients were figures beaten down by life, their souls empty. But Kaelen was not looking for them. He was looking for the painter Rune had mentioned, the artist watching his own work, and then he saw him, a man standing alone in the farthest corner of the room, away from the others. He was not connected to a station like the others. He was just standing, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the pained expressions on the face of a woman lying in one of the stations with the careful and delighted attention of a gourmet. Tasting a rare wine, the man was in his late 50s, thin and slightly stooped. He was wearing an old-fashioned, dark coat, high quality like Kaelen's, but worn and shiny with the years. His face was thin and intellectual, but in his eyes, a jaded, weary cynicism had replaced the brilliant intelligence that had once been there. This was the look of a man who had seen the pinnacle of his profession and then fallen into darkness. This had to be Silas Marner. Kaelen began to walk slowly towards him. Each of his steps was like a hammer blow in this silent hell. Marner noticed him approaching, but he didn't move. He just turned his head slightly and looked at Kaelen. There was neither surprise nor fear in his eyes. It was as if he had been expecting him. "A young artist," Marner said, his voice rusty. "And fragile, like the string of a long unused instrument. They don't come around here much. The sterile air of the upper world suits their tastes more than our raw reality here." "Silas Marner," Kaelen said, a statement, not a question. The man smiled faintly. That name was buried long ago, along with a license. Now it's just an echo. He turned his gaze back to the station with the suffering woman. "Look," he whispered, a perverse pride in his voice. "This is one of my works. The last 90 seconds of a space cargo ship pilot's life as his ship is pulled into the event horizon of a black hole. The bending of time, the body being torn apart atom by atom. Pure, poetic fear. Not like those artificial rains and sad jazz melodies in your studio, is it?" It was a direct challenge. Marner knew who Kaelen was and what kind of artist he was. "I saw a master's work," Kaelen said, not getting sidetracked. "A memory graft, very clean, very complex. The emotional core was taken from another mind, but the skeleton was woven with the recipient's own memories. There are very few people who could do such a work." Marner shrugged as if uninterested. "You can find all kinds of talent in the veins, but this is not just talent," Kaelen insisted. "This is a signature. An invisible code was left inside the memory, one that only another artist could see. Your signature, Marner." Marner finally turned fully to Kaelen. The mocking expression in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You're playing a dangerous game, kid," he said. "You're looking for things in other people's minds that don't belong to you. I am looking for something that does belong to me," Kaelen said, lowering his voice. "The grafted memory, it belonged to my daughter." This confession briefly cracked the cold mask on Marner's face. An emotion Kaelen had not expected appeared in his eyes. Not surprise, but almost pity. "In that case," Marner said, his voice now a whisper, "you haven't just opened the wrong door. You have entered the dragon's lair, and the dragon now has your scent." Marner's final words hung in the cold metallic air of the raw feed. The dragon now has your scent. It wasn't a warning. It was a death sentence. Kaelen understood in that moment that when he had locked the door to his studio, he had left behind not only his old life but also his safety. He was now the prey, and his hunter was watching him from the all-seeing tower at the city's apex. He asked Marner no more questions. There was nothing left to ask. He silently turned and left the gallery of nightmares as he had come, slipping through the shadows. When he returned to the chaotic, neon-washed streets of the veins, the noise of the crowd and the smell of spices in the air gave him a fleeting sense of false normality. But he knew now that even in this crowd, he was alone and a target. He couldn't go back to his studio. It was no longer safe. Silas's men were probably already there, erasing his digital and physical traces. The idea of going to the regulators now seemed like madness. Silas's reach was longer than the law itself. He had only one path left, to go deeper. If you're going to fight a dragon, you first have to learn how its scales are woven, where its lair is, and most importantly, its weak spot. He couldn't do this alone. Information brokers like Rune could only scratch the surface. Kaelen needed to enter the city's digital subconscious, the invisible network where memories and secrets were traded as whispers. The whisper net dot. He had only one place in mind. In the heart of the veins, a shop forgotten by time called The Forgotten Ink, which sold old, analog books. It was an anachronism in the digital age. But its owner, an old blind man named Elias Vance, was one of the city's oldest and most trusted archivists of information. Vance didn't trust digital trails. He believed in human whispers and the memory of paper. When Kaelen entered the shop, the familiar, peaceful smell of old paper that filled it was a stark contrast to the crisis he was living through. Vance was waiting for him in the dim light, reading the embossments of an old binding with his fingertips. His blind eyes were focused directly on Kaelen, as if he could see his soul. "The wind blows hard from the north, young artist," Vance said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "And you are caught right in the middle of it." "I need your help, Vance," Kaelen said, setting aside the formalities. "I need to get into the whisper net." Vance nodded slowly. "That net is full of spiders, and you look like a tasty fly." "What are you looking for there?" Kaelen hesitated. But he knew he could trust Vance. "A ghost," he said. "Not a memory thief. Someone who creates memories. Someone who can take a memory and graft it flawlessly into another mind, as if it had always been there. A master." The calm expression on Vance's face faltered for a moment. His fingers froze on the book. "Dangerous waters," he whispered. "I haven't heard that name in a very long time." "He's more than a whisper. He is a legend. They call him the master artist." There it was. The truth that Marner had implied, that one Kaelen had feared. He was not alone. He had a reflection, one who lived in the shadows, one without morals. "What do you know about him?" Kaelen asked. "Very little," said Vance. "No one has seen his face. No one knows his real name. He is known only by his works. He signs his memories, like works of art, but his signature is not a name. It's a feeling. The memories he grafts always leave behind a faint sense of wrongness, of déjà vu, like the edge of a dream. That small flaw in the perfection is his signature." This description perfectly matched the too clean memory, the screen feeling, Kaelen had sensed in Silas's mind. "And," Vance continued, lowering his voice even more, "according to legend, the master artist works for only one client, for years. He locks his greatest works, his darkest secrets, in the vault of a single mind." Kaelen's breath caught. Caspian Silus. Vance simply nodded. So that was the conspiracy. Silus wasn't just stealing memories. He was having his own reality, his own past, rewritten by this mysterious master artist. But why? What secret was so great that it was worth such a dangerous game? "How do I find him?" Kaelen asked. "You can't find him," said Vance. "You can only hope he finds you. But on the whisper net, you can follow the traces he leaves. He uses the purest, most raw memory materials to create his works, especially trauma memories. There is a place where these memories are illegally harvested, a factory. But to enter it means to put your own mind on the table." The factory Vance spoke of was not an industrial building with smoking chimneys. It was established in the deepest, most diseased part of the veins, inside the ice-cold remains of an abandoned cryogenic sleep center. From the outside, it was just a rusty metal door with a spray-painted symbol of a crying eye on it. This was a place where memories were harvested, where souls were distilled. And Vance's warning became a concrete reality. The moment he stepped through the door, the inside was as sterile and soulless as a hospital waiting room. The white, glossy floors and fluorescent lights were a stark contrast to the neon chaos outside. People sat on benches with expressionless faces and empty eyes. They were the donors. Some were here to pay off their debts, others to get their next dose of synthetic drugs. But they had all come to sell the same thing. Their Kaelen was met by a genderless and nameless attendant in a white lab coat, wearing a surgical mask. Without a word, the attendant scanned Kaelen's retina with the tablet in their hand. "Kaelen, memory artist, licensed, upper-level resident." A synthetic voice came from the attendant's tablet. "You are not a donor. Are you a buyer?" "I am neither a buyer nor a seller," Kaelen said, keeping his voice as steady as possible. "I wish to speak with the trader." This request seemed to disrupt the attendant's routine. They paused for a moment. Then, the tone of the voice from the tablet changed. "The memory trader only accepts guests for business. You must have an offer." Vance's words echoed in Kaelen's mind. To enter it means to put your own mind on the table. He had to pay the price. "I have an offer," Kaelen said. "A raw, first-class trauma memory." The attendant led him to a small, cube-shaped, completely white room. In the center of the room stood a single chair, similar to the stations at the Raw. "Feed but much more advanced. Upload the memory here," the synthetic voice said. "If the trader approves of its quality, she will accept you." Kaelen sat in the chair. The interface clamped onto his temples like cold metal fingers. Now he had to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Which of his sorrows would he sacrifice? The memory of Elara was untouchable. It was the reason for this war. It had to be something else. Something powerful, pure, and raw enough to attract the master artist's attention. He descended into the depths of his mind. To his childhood, to the day his father left home, to his mother's silent tears. No, these were sad, but not pure enough. Then, he went to the early years of his profession. The terrible moment when, as a young artist, he had gotten lost in a client's mind for the first time, had forgotten his own identity and been trapped in someone else's memories for hours. Yes, this would work. A memory artist's greatest fear, the moment of losing one's mental identity. It was a rare and valuable memory. He closed his eyes and brought that memory, with all its panic, identity loss, and terror, to the surface of his mind. The interface pulled the memory from him painfully, as if tearing a piece of him away. When the process was over, he felt empty and defiled. That memory was no longer entirely his. A copy of it was now in the database of this factory. A few minutes later, the door to the room opened. The attendant had returned. "The trader is waiting for you." The memory trader was watching everything from a huge circular operations center. In the heart of the factory, where hundreds of memory stations were located. She was not connected to a chair herself. On the contrary, she was managing the raw memory data flowing on dozens of holographic screens around her, like a stockbroker. The woman had sharp features, her hair was silver, and in her eyes was an absolute indifference, seeing human emotions only as data streams. "Impressive," the trader said, without looking at Kaelen. On the screen, the analysis graphs of the memory Kaelen had just sold were flowing. The moment an artist loses control, it will fetch a good price on the market. "What do you want, Kaelen?" "A memory of this quality could buy you a month of luxurious living or a new identity." "All I want is information," Kaelen said, "about the master artist." The trader suddenly stopped all the screens and turned in her chair to look directly at Kaelen. The indifferent expression on her face had given way to a dangerous curiosity. "Why is everyone suddenly after that ghost? Everyone?" "Last night, Silas Marner was here," the trader said. "He asked the same question. I told him nothing. Marner is an echo from the past. But you are different. You are still in the game. And you have a history with my biggest client, Caspian Silus." The trader knew everything. The whisper net lived up to its name. "The master artist is my best supplier and my biggest client," the trader continued. "He buys my purest, most powerful trauma memories. I don't ask what he does with them. That's not part of our business. But I can tell you this. He is currently working on a big project. His greatest work yet. And for that, he needs something he has never requested before. Pure childhood memories." The memory trader's final words spread like a poison in the sterile air of the factory. In that moment, Kaelen felt all the pieces coming together to form a horrific picture. The locked room in Caspian Silus's mind, the stolen pure memory of his own daughter Elara's final moments, and now, this new insatiable appetite of the master artist. It was not a coincidence, it was the beginning of a pattern. Elara's memory was not just a theft, it was a prototype, a test. Why? Kaelen asked, his voice no more than a whisper. Why childhood memories? The trader shrugged. For her, it was just a matter of supply and demand. Who knows? Maybe old men want to taste the innocence they've lost. Maybe they're looking for some kind of antidote. The master artist's motivations are not part of my business. My business is to meet the market's demand. And right now, the market wants childhood memories. The trader touched one of her holographic screens. A live feed of the factory's waiting room appeared on the screen. But now, it was not just indebted, desperate adult donors there. On the benches sat a few children, 10 or 12 years old, with their worried parents. They had come to sell the memory of their favorite toy or their first day of school so that their families could pay the next month's rent. It was the most cruel, most immoral exploitation of poverty. As you can see, the trader said, without a trace of emotion in her voice, the market always finds a way. The master artist is buying the memories of these children, but he says the quality is not good enough. Too much emotional noise. He is looking for a purer, rawer source. And I am sure he will find it soon. Kaelen understood then. What Vance meant by factory was not just this waiting room and the memory upload stations. This was just the tip of the iceberg. The real factory, the real harvest, was taking place somewhere behind this sterile facade, away from prying eyes. Tell me one more thing, Kaelen said, playing his last card. How does the master artist receive the memories? Is it a digital transfer? The trader hesitated for a moment. This was one of her business secrets. But in exchange for the valuable memory Kaelen had sold, she decided to give him one more crumb of information. No, she said. He doesn't trust digital trails. Just like the old masters. He records his works on organic-based, untraceable data crystals he calls crystal cores. And he always picks up those crystals from the same place, from the cryogenic storage in the lowest level of the factory, known as the cold room. This was the final clue Kaelen needed. He couldn't find the master artist, but he could find his shadow, his works. If he could get to those crystals, maybe he could reverse engineer them, uncover the master artist's digital signature, his next move, maybe even his identity. We have a deal, Kaelen said. Our business is done. He turned his back on the trader and left the factory the way he had come. But this time, he averted his eyes from the empty gazes of the children in the waiting room. Because in their fate, he saw an echo of his own daughter's fate. When he returned to the chaotic, living streets of the veins, Kaelen was no longer just a victim. He was no longer just a father seeking revenge. He had transformed into a hunter. And his prey was not just the master artist or Caspian Silus. His prey was the corrupt system itself, which saw memories as a commodity and souls as a raw material. His first step would be to infiltrate the heart of this factory, that cold room. It was a suicide mission. But Kaelen had nothing left to lose. He had already sold his most painful memory. He was now free from his fears. All that was left was a pure, cold purpose. And that purpose was pulling him towards the iciest, most dangerous level of this dark market. Leaving the factory was not a retreat, but a regrouping. As Kaelen blended into the crowd of the veins, his mind was already planning the next move, that suicide mission. Entering the cold room was not just a physical infiltration operation. It was an attack by one memory artist on the most protected sanctuary of another master. And Kaelen would enter this war on his own terms. He returned to Elias Vance's shop. The old blind archivist was waiting for him as if he had never left. Kaelen told him everything about the trader, the childhood memories, the crystal cores, and the cold room. Vance listened without a word. Finally, he slowly stood up, and from a hidden compartment at the back of the shop, he took out an old, leather-bound roll of blueprints. "These," said Vance, tracing the embossed lines with his fingertips, are the original architectural plans of the abandoned cryogenic center. I am not just a bookseller artist. I am a keeper of memories. And this city is full of secrets that should not be forgotten. The plan showed everything Kaelen needed: ventilation shafts, old maintenance tunnels, and most importantly, a forgotten geothermal energy line that ran directly beneath the cold room. This was his ticket in. That night, Kaelen became more of a ghost than a hunter. He wore a dark synthetic suit that absorbed light. He had no weapons. His weapons were the modified personal interface attached to his wrist and his mind itself. The plan was simple: enter through the energy line, infiltrate the cold room through a maintenance hatch in the floor, copy a crystal core, and disappear the way he came. Descending into the maintenance tunnels beneath the factory was like descending into hell. The air was hot and pressurized. The roar from the giant pipes filled his ears. But Kaelen was determined. After hours of climbing and crawling, he found himself in the icy space directly beneath the cold room. From above came the deep, rhythmic hum of the cryogenic coolers. Opening the maintenance hatch was the hardest part. The lock was not digital, but analog, but it was also pressure sensitive. The slightest wrong move could trigger the entire system's alarm. With the precision of a surgeon, Kaelen used his interface to mimic the lock's internal mechanism and tricked it. The hatch opened with a silent hiss dot as he slipped into the cold room. His breath instantly turned to vapor. This place was different from the sterile whiteness of the factory. It was more sacred, more dangerous. In the center of the room stood a massive, cylindrical cryogenic storage unit that stretched from floor to ceiling, slowly rotating. Behind the unit's glass surface, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small crystal cores glowed faintly with a blue light. These were the stolen souls, the frozen moments of innocence. Kaelen approached the main terminal next to the unit. He had little time. He connected his interface to the terminal's data port. A complex, organic encryption appeared on the screen. This was the work of the master artist. It looked more like a living organism than a code, but Kaelen did not try to fight it. Instead, he reached into the deepest corner of his own mind and pulled out a memory. The final moment of Elara, looking at him on her hospital bed, in pain but smiling. That pure, unadulterated memory of grief and love. He presented this memory to the encryption system like a key. For a moment, the system resisted. But then, faced with the purity of the raw, powerful emotion Kaelen offered, the encryption dissolved. The defense mechanism had perceived this memory not as a threat, but as pure data, just like itself. Kaelen was in. He quickly began to copy the data from one of the most recently uploaded crystal cores to his own drive. The progress bar slowly filled on the screen. 50%, 70%, 90%, and just then, the alarm went off. But this was not a physical alarm with sirens and flashing lights. It was a silent alarm that exploded inside Cullen's own mind. The terminal screen suddenly went black and a single symbol appeared on it. A crying eye dot. It was a trap. Bypassing the encryption was part of the plan. The master artist knew someone was coming, and he was waiting to meet them on his own turf. With his own weapons, Kaelen tried to pull his interface from the port, but it was too late. The data flow had reversed. A dark parasitic flood of data began to stream from the terminal into Kaelen's system. It was not a virus. It was a fragmented, corrupted, weaponized memory. It was a nightmare. Kaelen fell to his knees in pain. Inside his mind, he felt his own memories of his studio, of Elara's face, of Vance's shop being parasitized, corrupted, becoming unrecognizable. A foreign, malevolent entity was roaming inside his mind. It was erasing his identity, his memories, his very self. The attack had begun. And the battlefield was no longer the cold room, but Kaelen's own soul. The master artist's mental assault was not like a dagger. It was a solvent, an acidic leak that dissolved the invisible mortar, holding together the building blocks of Kaelen's memories, his identity, and his self. As his body convulsed in pain on the floor of the cold room, the real war was being fought millions of miles away, in the geography of his own soul. The parasitic nightmare that flowed into his mind was not meaningless noise. It was the fragmented, weaponized echoes of someone else's life. Kaelen was drowning in memories that were not his own. The laughter of a child he didn't know, swinging on a rusty swing. The face of a woman in terror, seen through the window of a burning building. The scream of metal, heard from the deck of a sinking ship in a cold ocean. These memories, like viruses, were infiltrating his own past, corrupting his most precious memories, and rewriting them. Before his eyes, the familiar rainy image of his studio appeared. But the drops on the glass were no longer water, but blood. Inside the memosphere, the ghost of his daughter Elara was standing, but her face had transformed into the face of the burning woman from the parasitic memories. "Father," she was whispering. But her voice was not his daughter's, but a chorus of dozens of different, suffering souls. This was the genius of the master artist. He wasn't just erasing, he was replacing. He was dismantling every brick of Kaelen's identity and replacing it with his own rotten, pain-filled bricks. Kaelen was becoming a stranger in his own mind. He began to forget his name, why he was here, who Elara was. Everything was turning into a meaningless fog. He was about to surrender. It was impossible to resist this pain, this chaos. But then, in the deepest depths of that fog, a single unshakable image appeared. The anchor. The mental sanctuary. He hadn't touched in years, but whose existence he had never forgotten. The last branch every memory artist had to hold on to in the moment of losing their identity. With the last remnants of his will, he focused on that memory, the final moment of Elara. But this time, he did not just summon the pain and the grief. He summoned the pure, unconditional love behind that memory, the love that made even that pain precious. The warmth he felt holding his daughter's hand, the calm breathing he heard despite the rhythmic beeping of the machines, the unbreakable spirit that made his daughter smile at him even in the midst of her pain. This love was the complete opposite of the fragmented, hate, and fear-filled memories sent by the master artist. Order against chaos. Love against hate. In Kaelen's mind, these two opposing forces collided like the birth of a star. That memory of love spread over the parasitic memories like a shield. It did not destroy them, but it silenced them, neutralized them, pushed them beyond the boundaries of his own mind. Using this memory as a weapon, Kaelen pushed back the foreign entity that had invaded his mind, back to where it came from, back to that data port. With a final act of will, he severed the mental connection. He came to shaking on the floor of the cold room. He had the taste of blood in his mouth. His eyes were burning. His mind was like a battlefield, filled with wreckage, smoke, and pain. But he was alive. And most importantly, he was himself. He remembered his name. He remembered his daughter. He remembered why he was here. He furiously ripped his interface from the still leaking terminal. He looked at the drive on his wrist. The copy process had been interrupted at 98%, but that didn't matter. He had something. He was wounded, yes. His mind would forever bear the scars of this attack. He knew now that the master artist was not just a ghost, but a ruthless hunter who knew the darkest corners of his mind. But the hunter had made a mistake. He had attacked his prey, but he had not killed it. And now, Kaelen didn't just want revenge. He didn't just want justice. He now knew how this war could be won. His enemy's greatest weapon was pain and chaos. Kaelen's greatest weapon was the purest form of a memory, love. Getting up from the floor of the cold room was like rising from a grave. Every muscle in Kaelen's body protested with the physical backlash of that mental battle. His mind was like a debris-strewn coastline after a storm. Foreign pieces of dark, unknown memories had washed up on the familiar shores of his own. But there was no time. The silence of the factory was like a thin sheet of ice that could break at any moment. He threw himself back through the maintenance hatch and into the suffocating darkness of the tunnels. The journey back was like walking through a nightmare. The parasitic memories in his mind had not completely disappeared. They were suppressed, yes. But now, taking advantage of his fatigue and weakness, they were trying to seep through the cracks. Every time he closed his eyes, the images of the burning building, the sinking ship, appeared. The sound of his own footsteps sometimes turned into the creak of a rusty swing. His trust in his own mind, that most fundamental, unshakable belief, had been shattered. When he reached the back door of Elias Vance's shop, he could barely find the strength to stand. The old man didn't say a word when he opened the door. He just saw Kaelen's exhausted state, took him by the arm, and led him inside to his small, dim room at the back of the shop. He sat him in a chair, covered him with a blanket, and placed a hot, steaming cup of tea in front of him. "How was the war, artist?" Vance asked after a while. "I lost," Kaelen whispered. "I ran." "No," said Vance, his blind eyes as if seeing Kaelen's bruised and battered soul. "You survived. The two are not the same. A warrior always chooses to survive, because that means he can fight again tomorrow." Kaelen held the cup with trembling hands. That night, in the peaceful silence of Vance's shop, he wrestled with the aftershocks of that terrible war in his mind. Every time he drifted off to sleep, foreign nightmares choked him, and he drifted between his own past and the tragedies of others. Sometimes when he woke up, he wasn't sure who he was. His reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger for a moment. The master artist had not been able to kill him, yes, but he had poisoned him with the poison of distrust. But in that darkness, there was one thing he could hold on to. That memory. The final moment of Elara. Now, when he summoned that memory, he didn't just feel the pain and the grief. That memory was now a lighthouse, a compass, an anchor for him. When his mind began to drift in the storm of those foreign memories, he held on to that memory with all his will. To the warmth of holding his daughter's hand, to the purity of her smile. This memory reminded him of who he was. He was not just a memory artist. He was Elara's father. And no parasite, no dragon, could tear that identity from him. That memory was his greatest tragedy, yes. But now, it was also his greatest strength, his most unshakable fortress. The next day, when he had regained some of his strength, he and Vance began to examine the data from the 98% copied crystal core. The data was largely corrupted due to the attack. It consisted of intertwined, meaningless codes and fragmented emotional frequencies. But after hours of analysis, Vance noticed a pattern. "Look," he said, tracing his finger over the holographic screen. "Within this chaotic data, there's a repeating, almost musical structure. A signature. But this is not a code. This is a location, geographical coordinates." When they entered the coordinates into the city map, the result took their breath away. The point indicated one of Ethelberg's oldest, most prestigious art galleries, Galerie Nemo, the place where memories were exhibited, where the rich came to watch the lives of others as works of art. And in that moment, Kaelen understood everything. The master artist was not a ghost, he was an artist. And like any artist, he wanted his works to be appreciated, to be seen. He wasn't just stealing memories, he was turning them into works of art and exhibiting them to the city's most elite audience. And Caspian Silus was not his biggest client, but his greatest patron, the protector of his art. The battlefield was no longer the dark streets or factories of the veins. The war was now moving to Ethelberg's brightest, most public stage, and Kaelen had to step onto that stage and confront the monster who was exhibiting his own daughter's stolen memory. The battlefield was now Ethelberg's brightest, most public stage. But before stepping onto that stage, Kaelen had to understand the only weapon he had, the corrupted data from the 98% copied crystal core. The back room of Elias. Vance's shop had transformed into a war room. For hours, Kaelen sat in front of the holographic screen, searching for a logic, a pattern, in that chaotic data stream. This was not just about breaking a code. It was about trying to understand. Another artist's soul, his brushstrokes, his signature. This was reverse engineering. His mind was still a wreck. The foreign parasitic memories left by the master artist's attack would surface in his weakest moments, breaking his concentration. Sometimes as he looked at the codes on the screen, the image of a burning building would flash before his eyes, his fingers pausing for a moment. Each time, he had to reach into the depths of his mind and hold on to his anchor, to that painful but pure memory of Elara, to pull himself back to the present. This war was being fought not only outside, but also inside his own mind. He's not just encrypting data, Kaelen said after hours of silence. His voice was tired but sharp. He is weaving the memory like a living organism. Each data packet is connected to the next by an emotional frequency. One is meaningless without the other. It's not a chain. It's a neural network. If you try to break it, the entire system self-destructs. So it's a dead end, said Vance from his chair. No, Kaelen said, a new light shining in his eyes. It's also his weak spot. If you can't destroy this neural network, you can hijack it. You can send it a new signal that looks like one of its own memories, but is actually a Trojan horse. The plan was slowly taking shape in his mind. Entering Gallery Nemo and stealing a crystal or hacking a terminal were crude and primitive methods. The master artist would be expecting such an attack. Kaelen had to answer him with his own art on his own stage. Just then, one of Vance's contacts on the WhisperNet returned with a new crumb of information. There's movement, Vance said, reading the text coming from an old analog terminal on the table with his fingertips. Gallery Nemo has announced the biggest event of the year in 3 days. A new exhibition from an anonymous master, Pure Memory. Only the most elite clients are invited. And the sponsor is, of course, Caspian Silus. This was their only chance. That night, the gallery would be at its most protected, but also at its most vulnerable. All its systems would be working at full capacity to broadcast the new exhibition flawlessly. This was the perfect opportunity for Kaelen to slip his Trojan horse inside. Can you do it? Asked Vance. To hijack the entire gallery network from a single point, it's never been done before. I have to, Kaelen said. He fixed his eyes on that musical repeating signature within the corrupted data. This signature is not just a location, it's a key. A personal frequency the master artist uses to upload his own works to the gallery. Network. If I can mimic that frequency, if I can send it a data packet that looks like a pure childhood memory, as it expects, but is actually under my control, I can walk in through the system's front door. The plan was insanely audacious. Kaelen would not physically enter the gallery on the night of the exhibition. He would, from anywhere in the city, using his own interface, infiltrate the gallery network and replace the master artist's exhibition with his own. He would show that select audience where the pure memories they were buying really came from, on what sorrows they were built. But to do that, he needed the perfect Trojan horse, a memory pure enough to deceive the master artist's system, but complex enough to carry Kaelen's control code. And Kaelen knew which memory to use. He reached into the depths of his mind, into that most protected, most unshakable fortress, to his anchor, to the final memory of Elara. But this time, he looked at it not as a sanctuary, but as a weapon. He would take the pure grief, the unadulterated love within that memory, and turn it into an artist's greatest work, his most dangerous weapon. He would use his own pain as a battering ram to bring down his enemy's fortress. On the night of the exhibition, Gallery Nemo shone like the brightest star in Ethelberg. The soft white light seeping from its glass walls drew the city's elite. like moths to a flame. Inside, the atmosphere was filled with a sterile luxury and an emotional voyeurism. The scent of expensive perfumes mingled with the clinking of champagne glasses, and the richest, most powerful people in the city strolled in front of the memispheres on the walls, as if examining rare paintings. Inside each sphere, moments of innocence played out. A child blowing out the candles on a birthday cake, a baby's first steps, a father teaching his son to ride a bike. These were the works of the pure memory exhibition. But Kaelen knew the darkness behind these scenes. These were not donated, but stolen memories. Fragments of souls harvested from poverty and desperation, then polished and served up for the consumption of this wealthy audience, miles away from this glittering hell. In the dusty and silent back room of Elias Vance's shop, Kaelen was in a hell of his own. On the holographic screen in front of him, the deepest, most painful memory of his own mind. The final moment of Elara was playing out as a data stream. This was all he had been doing for the last 3 days. He was shaping his own soul with patience and pain, like a master smith forging a sword. This was not a simple copy-paste operation. He was taking the purest emotional frequencies of the memory, the warmth he felt holding his daughter's hand, the heartbreaking innocence in her final smile, his own helpless grief, and weaving his control code, that Trojan horse, into these frequencies like a strand of DNA. It was an incredibly dangerous process. He had to relive that memory, feel that pain over and over again. But this time, not as a mourner, but as a surgeon. He had to feel the emotions, but not be consumed by them. The parasitic memories in his mind were waiting for this moment of weakness, trying to seep in from the edges of his consciousness. It was both a creation and a struggle for survival. Finally, he was ready. In his hands, he had a digital ghost that, from the outside, looked like the purest, most poignant memory in the world, but inside, carried the poison that would stop. A system's heart dot in the gallery. The high point of the evening had arrived. Caspian Silus stepped up to a podium. He had the calm, proud expression of a patron of the arts. "Tonight," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "you are witnessing not just an exhibition, but a revolution. The purest form of art, unfiltered, unmediated emotion itself. Now I leave you with our master's latest work, the memory titled The First Snowflake." All the spheres in the hall went dark. And then, in sync, they all began to project a single memory. The moment a 5-year-old girl saw snowfall for the first time in her life. That pure, unadulterated moment of wonder and joy. The audience watched, mesmerized. This was the moment Kaelen had been waiting for. In Vance's shop, his fingers were flying across the keyboard. He caught the master artist's musical signature, that personal frequency. And onto that frequency, he sent his Trojan horse, the memory of Elara, under the name The First Teardrop. For a moment, nothing happened. Snowflakes were still falling in the spheres in the gallery. Kaelen's heart was about to stop. He had failed, but then a low beep came from Vance's terminal. He was in the system dot in the spheres in the gallery. The happy snow scene flickered for a moment. Meaningless lines, like television static, appeared on the image. The audience began to murmur, thinking it was a technical glitch. But Kaelen knew what it was. It wasn't the system. It was someone inside the system. The master artist had noticed the intruder. Kaelen suddenly felt another presence in his mind. A cold, analytical, and incredibly powerful consciousness. Just like in the cold room, but this time it wasn't hiding. This was a direct confrontation. The master artist was trying to eject the virus that had infiltrated his network. The two artists in that digital space had begun a silent, invisible duel with codes and emotional frequencies. The master artist was sending firewalls, layers of encryption at Kaelen. But Kaelen wasn't fighting them. He just kept pumping the pure, irresistible grief of Elara's memory like a wave, into the veins of the system. And in that moment, the master artist made a mistake. To find the source of Kaelen's attack, he sent a probe towards him. He touched Kaelen's mind for an instant to identify him. This was the moment Kaelen had been waiting for. He caught that touch. And using that connection, he pushed not just his memory, but his own consciousness into the network, towards his enemy's fortress. He was no longer just a hacker. He was a ghost in the system. And now, he was about to come face to face with his enemy. As Kaelen's consciousness slipped into the digital veins of the gallery network like a ghost, he found himself in an endless dark space. This was the geography of the mind, where code and data became a physical place. And in that geography, he was not alone. Opposite him, as distant as a memory, but as unreachable, stood another consciousness, the master artist. They did not speak in words. Their battle was fought with pure will and intent, with waves of data sent against each other's mental structures. The master artist was cold, methodical, and ruthless. He sent the fragmented, chaotic memories he had experienced in the cold room at Kaelen like digital missiles. But Kaelen was prepared now. He took refuge in the fortress of his mind, in his anchor. Using the memory of Elara as a shield, he met every attack. In the gallery, the physical reflections of this silent war were appearing in the memispheres. The innocent snowflake scene was now completely gone. The spheres were now flashing with meaningless, chaotic images leaking from the mental battle of the two artists: burning buildings, sinking ships, crying children. The audience was recoiling in horror and confusion, trying to understand how this work of art had turned into a nightmare. The proud expression on Caspian Silus's face at the podium had been replaced by an icy rage. Someone had infiltrated his perfect, controlled world. Kaelen knew he couldn't stay on the defensive. He had to attack. But the master artist's defense was like an iceberg, cold, layered, and impenetrable. In that moment, Kaelen realized something. His enemy's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his lack of emotion. The master artist saw memories as data, as a commodity. He didn't feel them. Kaelen made his final move. He stopped using the memory of Elara, that Trojan horse, as a shield. Instead, he opened it completely. He sent all the pure, unadulterated emotion within that memory, the love, the grief, the helplessness, raw and unfiltered, directly into the consciousness of the master artist. This was not a data attack. This was a flood of emotion. The master artist was caught unprepared for this move. He had manipulated thousands of memories, turned the darkest fears into works of art, but he had never before been in direct contact with such a pure, such a real emotion. That unadulterated grief created a crack in his fortress of ice, and the love that seeped through that crack melted all his defenses. Kaelen heard a scream in his mind. And with that scream, the identity of the master artist was revealed, like a veil being lifted. Kaelen fell into his mind, into his deepest memory. The face he saw was familiar. A face changed by years and pain, but one he had never forgotten. Silas Marner. But that was not all he saw. Next to Marner, on a sickbed, was a little girl. Marner's daughter. And Kaelen understood with horror that the girl was dying of the same disease, the relentless disease that had taken Elara from him. Marner was not a monster. He was a reflection of Kaelen in a broken mirror. A man who could not cope with his own grief, and so had escaped from it by turning the sorrows of others into works of art. And in that moment, Kaelen understood everything. Silas had not just kept Marner as an artist. He had used Marner's grief as a weapon to control his genius. Silas had promised Marner to replace his daughter's memory with a better, less painful one. The memory of Elara was that perfect, that pure farewell that would replace the memory of Marner's daughter. This was not just a theft. It was a plan to replace one soul with another. With the rage that came with this realization, Kaelen made his final move. All the memispheres in the gallery went dark for a moment. Then, they all began to project a single massive scene that it was. The final moment of Elara, Kaelen's helpless weight in that hospital room. His daughter's last smile. That heartbreaking goodbye. But this was just the beginning. Kaelen added the corrupted data he had copied from the cold room to Elara's memory like a film strip. On the spheres, the faces of the children in the factories. Waiting room now appeared. Those innocent, frightened faces selling their memories. And then, the raw data streams, showing how each of the pure memories in the exhibition had been forcibly torn from the minds of these children. The audience was no longer just watching a work of art. They were watching the bloody, ruthless production process of this art. They were seeing that the innocence they had bought was obtained by the theft of another's innocence. This was not an exhibition. This was an indictment. The face of Caspian Silus, standing at the podium, had turned into a frozen mask of rage. He shouted at the security guards. But it was too late. The truth had been exhibited in the digital world. Marner's consciousness had been shattered under the flood of pure emotion and reality that Kaelen had unleashed. The connection was broken. Kaelen found himself back in the back room of Vance's shop. He was exhausted, his soul bruised and battered. But he was free. That night, a riot broke out at Gallery Nemo. The regulators arrested Silus and the memory. Traitor, the factory was raided. The WhisperNet collapsed. Kaelen was the hero of that night. But he did not go to receive his medal. That night, he quietly left Vance's shop and disappeared into the neon-washed crowd of the veins. He was no longer a memory artist. He was now just Elara's father. And for the first time in 7 years, when he remembered his daughter's memory, the only thing he felt was not just pain. Alongside the pain, there was the calm, peaceful warmth of justice. She gained her memory back. And this was the greatest victory that could be achieved.